Well, I'm not a farmer.
You're not
I'm very much a trainee farmer.
But you're a farm owner.
Yeah, I've got the farm and I work on it every day. So we've got this farm shop now. We've had to mow a field near it so people can park there.
What happens when a farmer looks at his fields and decides the smartest move is to grow absolutely nothing? For Jeremy Clarkson, that meant leaving 200 acres of diddly-squat farm unplanted after the numbers showed wheat and barley would certainly lose money. Rising input costs, difficult clay soil, livestock restrictions, and a brutal harvest season pushed the farm into unfamiliar territory. Then Clarkson got his hands on a 13-ton digger and started digging ponds, building dams, and tearing out hedges. Even more ironically, the farm later hosted thousands of agricultural professionals. So what really happened to Clarkson's farm? The farming math that changed everything. Let's start with the number that explains everything else in this story. Writing in his regular newspaper column, Clarkson laid out the decision in the plainest terms he could manage. 200 acres of his farm grew absolutely nothing this year, and the reasoning behind that choice came down to simple arithmetic. In his own words, he and his team knew that planting wheat or barley on that land would definitely result in a loss. That statement isn't just one farmer venting. Independent analysis of this season's wheat economics backs up exactly what Clarkson described. According to cost breakdowns reported by Farmers Weekly, the break-even yield for feed wheat this season sits at just under 7 tons per hectare, against a break-even price of roughly £139 a ton. Futures were trading higher than that, closer to £168, which sounds like good news until you factor in the full cost of actually growing the crop. That full cost, once fertilizer, seed, chemicals, cultivation, and harvesting are all added together, comes to roughly £1,100 per hectare. Even in a genuinely good year, with an 8-ton yield selling at a strong price, the net margin works out to somewhere around £170 per hectare. That's not a typo, and it's not pessimism. That's the actual arithmetic facing British arable farmers this season. On paper, before a single thing goes wrong. And plenty can go wrong. A single wet season, the kind of weather that isn't unusual on the heavy clay soil Clarkson's farm sits on, can knock that 8-ton yield down to 6 tons without much warning. On that thinner margin, a drop like that doesn't just shrink the profit, it erases it completely and turns the whole exercise into a loss, which is exactly the outcome Clarkson said he was trying to avoid by leaving those 200 acres unplanted in the first place. Clay soil carries its own particular set of challenges that make this risk calculation even more precarious than it would be on lighter land. It drains poorly after heavy rain, meaning machinery can't get onto the fields for planting or harvesting during exactly the windows when timing matters most. It compacts easily under the weight of tractors and combines, which can damage root development for whatever crop eventually does get planted. Farmers working land like Clarkson's are, in a very real sense, playing a harder version of the same game every other arable farmer in the country is already struggling with. Here's the part that makes this bigger than one famous farmer's frustration. Industry survey data shows barley planting across the entire country falling to its lowest level in roughly 15 years, with a significant rise nationwide in the amount of arable land simply left uncropped for this harvest. So when Clarkson describes the economics as impossible, he isn't exaggerating for effect. He's describing a calculation that farms across Britain are running through right now and reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion. That national context is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes what might otherwise look like an isolated, headline-friendly decision from a celebrity farmer. Independent growers across the country, without a television crew documenting their every move, are reaching the exact same conclusion on their own land, for the exact same reasons. The difference is that most of them don't have a national newspaper column or a hit television show to explain that decision to millions of people. Clarkson, in that sense, has simply become the most visible face of a genuinely widespread industry problem. What makes this particularly striking for Diddley Squat specifically is the contrast with how the farm started. Clarkson bought this land hoping to learn a trade many assumed was straightforward. Instead, season after season has revealed exactly how thin the margins really are, to the point where the safest financial decision available to him this year was to grow nothing at all on a fifth of his farm. There's also a storage dimension to this economic puzzle that rarely gets discussed alongside the headline numbers. Diddley Squat has grown an increasingly wide range of crops over recent seasons, and documents submitted to local planning authorities for a new grain store explained the problem plainly. Without enough storage space, a farmer can only sell a harvest at whatever price happens to be on offer the moment the crop comes in, rather than waiting for a better one. Third-party storage, the same documents noted, is both hard to find and expensive to use. That's another quiet cost squeezing margins that were already thin to begin with, well before weather or planting decisions even enter the picture. Zoom out across the broader farming economy, and the individual cost categories driving this math tell their own story. Fertilizer, seed, and crop chemical prices have all climbed substantially in recent years, often outpacing the price farmers can actually get for their finished grain. Add rising fuel costs for the machinery required to plant, spray, and harvest a crop this size, and the gap between what it costs to grow wheat and what that wheat is actually worth keeps narrowing, season after season, regardless of how skilled or hard-working the farmer running the operation happens to be. Why Clarkson left 200 acres empty. Leaving farmland empty isn't a decision farmers make lightly, and it wasn't one Clarkson arrived at alone. His land agent, a figure fans of the show know well as Cheerful Charlie, advised against sowing spring barley and durum wheat on those specific fields this season. That's a professional recommendation, not a spontaneous decision made in frustration, and it reflects exactly how seriously the economics of this particular season were being taken behind the scenes. That contrast with previous years is hard to miss. Fields that had been cultivated, harvested, and fought over across multiple seasons of the show simply sat untouched this time around. For a project that's always been framed around Clarkson learning to actually farm, rather than simply own land, that emptiness represents something closer to a retreat than a rotation. What does it actually mean for a working farm to simply opt out of an entire growing cycle on a fifth of its acreage? The wheat and barley decision also wasn't happening in isolation. In that same column, Clarkson noted that portions of Diddley Squat remained under a bovine tuberculosis restriction, a separate and ongoing complication that's added its own financial and logistical strain on top of the crop economics. Running a farm dealing with a livestock restriction at the same time it's making the call to leave arable land empty paints a picture of a business fighting fires on more than one front simultaneously. It's worth understanding what leaving land fallow actually costs, beyond simply the crop revenue that never materializes. Empty fields still need managing. Weeds need controlling. Soil health still needs attention, even without a harvest to show for any of it at the end of the season. Fallow land isn't free land. It's land that costs money to maintain, while generating no income whatsoever, which makes the decision to leave 200 acres that way even more telling about how bad the alternative math actually looked. Diddley Squat has cultivated an unusually wide range of crops across its various seasons on the show, from winter wheat and durum wheat to spelt, oats, and oilseed rape, largely in an attempt to find something, anything, that could turn a reliable profit on this specific land. That constant experimentation is itself evidence of how difficult, profitable arable farming has proven to be here, season after season, well before this year's decision to leave planting behind, entirely on a significant portion of the farm. 200 acres is not a small amount of ground to simply set aside. It represents a genuine acknowledgement that, on this particular farm, in this particular season, the traditional approach to arable farming had stopped making financial sense entirely, not as a temporary setback, but as a calculated business decision made with professional advice behind it. The internal conversations behind that decision matter too, even if viewers only ever see the outcome. A choice this significant doesn't get made on a whim. even by a farmer with Clarkson's reputation for impulsive decisions on the show. It required sitting down with the land agent, reviewing the specific economics of those 200 acres, and concluding that the safest outcome, financially, was to accept zero revenue rather than risk a guaranteed loss. That's a fundamentally different kind of decision-making than anything the earlier seasons of the show typically documented, when enthusiasm and trial and error tended to drive most of the farm's choices. There's also a practical side to leaving land fallow that goes beyond simply avoiding a loss. Unplanted land can sometimes qualify for environmental stewardship schemes or soil recovery programs, options that convert an empty field from a pure cost center into at least a partial source of income or long-term soil benefit. Whether Diddley Squat pursued any such scheme on these specific acres wasn't detailed in Clarkson's own account, but the broader point stands. Leaving land empty in modern British farming isn't necessarily the same as leaving it entirely without purpose. The digger changed everything. Faced with 1,000 acres of land that had, in his own words, become effectively useless for its original purpose, Clarkson didn't simply let the season pass quietly. He hired a 13-tonne digger. It's the kind of decision that sounds almost comedic on paper, and Clarkson himself seemed to recognize exactly that. He described the combination of heavy machinery and idle time as, in his words, the most dangerous combination in the world for a man. It's a self-aware line, acknowledging that handing an already restless farmer a piece of enormous excavating equipment during a season with less actual farming to do was never going to end with the machine sitting quietly in a shed. True to that observation, Clarkson put the digger to immediate use. He described excavating a pond and constructing a dam, the kind of ambitious infrastructure project that wouldn't have fit into a normal, fully planted growing season. With 200 acres not requiring the usual attention, suddenly there was time and heavy machinery available for exactly this kind of undertaking. The pond and dam weren't the end of it either. By his own account, Clarkson tore out a hedge after lunch on the same day, treating the digger less like a tool for a single planned task, and more like an open invitation to reshape whatever part of the landscape caught his attention next. It's a detail that captures something genuinely true about how differently this season has unfolded compared to the show's earlier years. There's a real logic underneath the comedy here, even if it wasn't the primary motivation. A farmer suddenly, without the usual demands of managing 200 acres of crops, has to find something productive to do with that time and that land. And infrastructure work, ponds, drainage, land reshaping, is exactly the kind of long-term investment that's easy to justify when the usual planting and harvesting calendar isn't dictating every single week. He summed up the appeal of the machine himself, joking that an ordinary man faced with a big job would usually decide it required too much effort and head to the pub instead, but that inside a digger, no job feels too big to tackle. It's a light-hearted way of describing what was, underneath the humor, a genuinely difficult season being filled with whatever productive work was actually available. Whatever the underlying motivation, the results of that digger work weren't purely cosmetic. A new pond and dam represent genuine long-term infrastructure for a working farm, useful for drainage management, livestock water access, and even wildlife habitat. The kind of project that farms often want to tackle, but rarely find the calendar space for during a busy, fully planted season. In that sense, the empty acres that created the opportunity for this work also, indirectly, delivered something of lasting value to the farm, even if that value has nothing to do with a wheat or barley harvest. This wasn't the first time Diddley Squat's downtime had been redirected into ambitious side projects either. Across the show's history, slow stretches and failed harvests have repeatedly become the backdrop for Clarkson's other ventures. The farm shop, the restaurant, the pub, each one born, at least partly, out of the same restless instinct to keep busy when the traditional farming side of the operation wasn't providing enough to do or enough income to justify doing it. Placed side by side, The freshly dug pond and the still empty field next to it capture this entire season in a single image, one part of the farm being actively reshaped and improved, the other part left completely alone because the numbers simply didn't justify touching it at all. The farm that wasn't farming. In June, Diddley Squat hosted Cereals, the UK's flagship arable farming event, drawing more than 25,000 farmers and agricultural professionals from across the country to Clarkson's own fields. On paper, it's an enormous honor for any working farm. In practice, given everything already described about this particular season, it created a genuinely uncomfortable irony that Clarkson himself was the first to point out. Writing about the event ahead of time, he admitted to feeling a strange mix of emotions about hosting it. He said he was proud that Diddley Squat had been selected, but also a little embarrassed, because tens of thousands of farmers would spend 2 days talking non-stop about farming, on a farm where, in his own words, not much actual farming was going on. That's not an exaggeration for comic effect. By the time Cereals arrived, the same farm hosting the event was sitting on 200 unplanted acres and still dealing with the ongoing tuberculosis restriction, limiting its livestock operations. Clarkson said as much directly, stating plainly that they knew for a fact they wouldn't make money on wheat and barley that season, and that parts of the farm remained closed down because of the TB situation. The irony wasn't lost on the visiting farmers either, many of whom were dealing with versions of the exact same economic pressures on their own land. Cereals exists specifically to showcase agricultural innovation, new equipment, new techniques, new approaches to exactly the kind of margin problems Clarkson had just spent his column describing. Hosting that conversation on a farm, actively grappling with those same pressures, made the event feel less like a celebration and more like a very public case study. To his credit, Clarkson didn't try to hide any of this from the visiting crowd or his readers. Rather than presenting Diddley Squat as some kind of success story ahead of a major public event, he used the moment to be transparent about exactly how difficult the season had actually been, treating the timing as an opportunity for honesty rather than an inconvenience to manage around. There's something genuinely fitting about the setting once you think about it properly. An event built around solving the exact problems facing British arable farming, held on a farm that had just made the difficult, defensive decision those very problems demand, arguably made for a more honest showcase than a picture-perfect, fully planted farm ever could have. The event itself is genuinely significant within British agriculture, functioning as the industry's primary showcase for new machinery, seed varieties, and farming techniques each year. Being selected to host it represents real recognition within the farming community, a sign that Diddley Squat, whatever its financial struggles, had earned genuine standing among working farms rather than being dismissed as a celebrity vanity project. That recognition matters, particularly for a farmer who spent multiple seasons of television openly documenting his own mistakes and learning curve in front of a national audience. Hosting an event of this scale is also its own significant undertaking, requiring the farm to accommodate tens of thousands of visitors, dozens of vendor stands, and the accompanying infrastructure of parking, catering, and site management, all layered on top of the farm's existing operational challenges. Pulling that off successfully while simultaneously managing a livestock restriction and a fifth of the land sitting unplanted speaks to a level of organizational capability that goes well beyond what the show's earlier, more chaotic seasons might have suggested was possible. For the visiting farmers themselves, many facing versions of the same brutal arithmetic on their own land, seeing one of the industry's most recognizable faces speak this openly about his own struggles likely landed differently than a polished corporate presentation ever could. There's a credibility that comes from a farm owner admitting, in front of 30,000 of his peers, that the numbers on his own land simply hadn't worked out this season. That willingness to be publicly candid also fits a broader shift in how Clarkson has approached the farm's difficulties across the show's run. The earlier seasons leaned heavily on comedy, framing failed harvests and disastrous decisions as entertainment first and financial reality second. This season's tone feels noticeably different, treating the numbers with the same seriousness a working farmer would, even while the humor around digger antics and hedge removal remains fully intact. Can a show built partly on comedy still function as a genuinely useful window into the state of British farming? Based on this season alone, it seems increasingly like the answer is yes. Clarkson's Harvest Nightmare. As if the economics alone weren't difficult enough, the weather delivered its own verdict on the season. Sharing a screenshot of the forecast for his corner of Oxfordshire, with temperatures climbing toward the high 20s, Clarkson posted a blunt assessment of what was left of his harvest prospects. His message was short and unmistakably direct. He wrote that the harvest was already finished, adding that he might as well just enjoy the heat now that the damage was effectively done. It's a dark joke, but one rooted in a genuinely serious situation unfolding across the country at the same time. That particular stretch of heat wasn't an isolated event either. England was bracing for its 5th heatwave of the year at that point, with forecasters weighing whether conditions were severe enough to warrant a rare amber or red extreme heat warning. Temperatures were expected to climb well past 30 degrees in the days that followed, extending a dry, rainless stretch that had already been quietly damaging crops across the region. The scale of the damage extends well beyond any single farm. Industry estimates place the potential financial toll of this particular harvest season at close to £400 million nationally, with early assessments suggesting 2026 could end up being remembered as one of the worst harvest years on record. A genuinely significant claim for an industry that keeps detailed records precisely because bad years are. This wasn't even the first time in recent memory Clarkson had delivered this kind of grim assessment. The previous year, he'd already described the farm as heading toward what he expected to be its worst season yet, noting that the year before that, one had already ranked as the 2nd poorest harvest on record. Read together, that's not a single bad season. It's a pattern stretching back multiple years, each one testing the farm's finances in a slightly different way. Taken all together, this season's story isn't really about one bad decision or one unlucky stretch of weather. It's about a genuinely difficult, multi-year economic reality finally catching up with even one of the country's most famous and most closely watched farms. Arable margins too thin to survive a normal wet year, a persistent livestock restriction limiting other revenue, and now a heatwave arriving at exactly the moment there was almost nothing left to protect. The autumn planting outlook, heading into the following season, doesn't offer much immediate relief either. Persistently dry conditions heading into the planting window make it significantly harder to establish the kind of healthy root systems that next year's crops will depend on, meaning this season's damage has a real chance of carrying consequences into the following year's harvest as well, rather than resolving itself the moment cooler weather eventually returns. Notably, none of this hardship has been kept off camera. With a 6th series of the show already confirmed and currently in production, these exact struggles, the fallow acres, the digger, the cereal's irony, the heat wave, are expected to feature prominently in upcoming episodes. That continued willingness to document genuine financial hardship rather than editing it out is arguably a big part of why the show has resonated as strongly as it has since it first started airing. Looking back across the show's history, this season fits a familiar, if increasingly serious, pattern. Diddley Squat's very first year on camera produced a profit so small it became a punchline in its own right. Subsequent seasons brought their own combinations of weather disasters, planning disputes, and disappointing yields. What's different this time isn't the presence of hardship, which has essentially been a constant throughout the show's run, but the scale of the response it required. Not a single failed crop, but 200 acres taken out of production entirely as a preventative measure. So where does that leave the farm, heading into whatever comes next? There's no guarantee that next season looks any easier. Input costs show no obvious sign of falling. Weather patterns show no obvious sign of stabilizing, and the broader industry data suggests the pressures facing Diddley Squat aren't unique to one farm or one famous owner, but part of a genuinely difficult stretch for British arable farming as a whole. Whatever comes next for Clarkson's farm, it's likely to keep reflecting exactly what's happening on working farms across the entire country, whether that's good news or, as this season has shown, considerably less so. So that is the answer. Growing nothing turned out to be the smartest move Jeremy Clarkson could make this year. Not because farming got easier, but because the numbers left no better option. 200 empty acres, a digger filling the silence. 25,000 farmers watching him admit the irony out loud. Then, a heat wave arrived to settle whatever doubt remained. This is not just Clarkson's story either. It is happening on farms across Britain right now, without the cameras. Do you think next season looks any easier? Let us know in the comments below. Hit like if you want more honest farming coverage, and subscribe for the next update.